This is a collection of recent stories from the Let's Not Meet subreddit that centre around dogs that, in one way or another, help save their owners. The last one is particularly chilling, especially since the author was just a little girl when it happened. Anyway, get cozy, and let's get into it, shall we? This happened a few years ago, around mid-November. My mother and I love being outside and going for walks. This night in particular was freezing, but we decided we wanted to go out for a quick walk. As we walked back home, we went down this one street we used all the time. It's a neighbourhood street leading to the main road and then back into our neighbourhood. We get halfway down the street when I hear a dog bark over the music on my phone. I turn it off and turn to look for the dog because I love dogs, and I wasn't aware there was a big dog on the street. For context, I know quite a few people on this street, and I know which houses have dogs. Most of the people on the block have small dogs or cats. This came from a house that didn't have a dog, let alone a big dog. I spun around and saw a big dark mass just feet from me. If he stepped 2 more feet, he would have been able to grab me. I immediately felt weird and started speed walking back to my mum, who at that point didn't realise I stopped. I turned off my phone and whispered to her that I thought we were being followed. She turned around, grabbed my arm, and told me there were 2 men right behind us. We started walking in a zigzag pattern, and sure enough, they followed our every step. Once they caught on that we knew, one of the dudes started to make small chit-chat with us. Awfully late for y'all to be walking, huh? I swear his voice sounded like the definition of the sirens' voices, luring sailors to their doom. He continued asking questions to us, and my mum kept walking and replying with quick replies. From the sound of his voice, I knew we were in danger, so I went to dial 911. Instead, my mum told me to call my dad as he could get to us quicker because we were almost home. We got to the busy street and looked behind us to see them speed walking to us. We decided to take a risk and ran into the middle of the street as cars passed on either side of us. We ran across again and met my dad on that side. We looked across the street and both men were gone. We got into the car and searched the streets, but these guys disappeared into what seemed like this air. I asked my mum if we would have been kidnapped if I hadn't heard the dog, and she asked me what dog. I asked her how she didn't hear this massive dog bark, especially with how good her hearing was. I still have no clue what it was I heard, but I do know it most likely saved my life. I just read another story about somebody having an encounter and their dog possibly saving their life. It reminded me of my own story with my pup. I rescued a pit bull from a neglectful family. She was skin and bones when she came home and extremely submissive. After a week of love, affection and food, she was the most amazing dog I have ever met. The softest, cuddliest baby who wouldn't even play fight with me unless she was under a blanket and did not know it was me. I needed to do a quick late-night run to my local shop. There is a 40-minute round-trip route on main roads with houses, or a 15-minute round-trip route through an alleyway that wraps around the back of a school field. This alleyway has no street lamps, but I hadn't ever heard of anything bad happening, so I didn't think anything of it. So I set out with my dog in tow. Just before we reached the entrance, she stood still as a rock. I gently tried to usher her to follow me, but she refused. When I took my headphones off, I realized that she was softly growling and that I could hear a group of male voices coming from the alley. They soon came close enough to where I could see them. I think there were around 5 or 6 of them. This was during COVID, so they all wore masks and had their hoods up. My mum always told me to not act scared if I found myself in a situation like this. Being scared shows that you are an easy target. With that in mind, I tugged firmly on my dog's lead to get her to follow me. She stuck to my side, literally pressing her body against my leg as I walked. Yes, it was awkward, and yes, I had to try very hard to walk normally. She was quietly growling the whole time. The men had stopped and were standing slightly off the path to one side at this point. They were talking quietly amongst themselves as we walked by. I couldn't really hear much as my heartbeat was pounding in my ears and my gut was screaming at me. Once I knew I was at a point where the darkness of the alley made me essentially invisible, I heard one of them raise their voice slightly and say, "Nah, that's a pit," in a way that sounded like he was disagreeing. Now, they could have just been discussing the breed of my dog. That is a likely scenario. But the gut feeling I had while walking past, and for the duration of my walk through the alley, makes me believe otherwise. I think that these men were discussing possibly robbing me, or worse, and my soft baby, who was literally scared of her own reflection, deterred them due to being an aggressive breed. It's safe to say that we walked the long way home. So, creepy group of men, let's not meet again. Some background: I, a 28-year-old female, am a dog walker pet sitter. Some of the dogs I walk have reactivity, as did this one dog, a pit lab mix. She used to be a bad puller and incredibly reactive to other dogs on leash as soon as she'd see them. Through lots of work and training with her, she has come a long way with her reactivity to the point it really is not an issue anymore, even when other owners' carelessness allows their dogs to get too close for comfort. On this one walk, she was an absolute dream the whole time. We passed multiple dogs without any issues. She would just look at me for her treat she knew she'd get if she was good. We turned down a side street that seemed completely vacant at the time, so I could give her some more relaxed walking time, and all went well for a while. Not a soul in sight, until there was. While I'm usually very good at keeping my head on a swivel, as some of my walks are not in the city's safest areas, this guy took me by surprise. I don't know how he did it, but he got about 2 or 3 feet behind us without me or my dog knowing he was there, and suddenly shouted something unintelligibly. I could only make out the last 2 words, "Your dog." Immediately my dog, with no prior history of human reactivity, got between us and started growling, snapping and lunging aggressively at this man. I'm a smaller woman at 5'3", and I'd guess this guy was 6'7" at the very least, and incredibly muscular. As soon as he saw my dog trying to attack him and me struggling to hold her back, he threw his arms up and bolted across the street without another word. He disappeared shortly after around a corner. I'd never praised a dog for reactivity until that moment. I gave her all the treats I had left in my pocket, took her home, and told her owner what had just happened, and how her dog might have saved my life. Of course, I hope I'm wrong. The guy was just slow with social cues. But neither the dog nor I got that impression. Needless to say, she's by far my favourite client dog. I still go on walks with her every week, but we haven't gone down that street again while there are no people. I'm beyond blessed to have her and get to walk her weekly, but I do hope I never meet the "your dog" guy again. This happened years ago, but the thought of it still keeps me up at night. I was walking through the hills of a provincial park with my dog during winter, so the sun set much faster than I expected, and before I could get back to my car. Once the sun was gone and all you could see was darkness, I was walking slowly through a field, when out of nowhere I had, to this day, the most gut-wrenching, undeniable feeling I was being watched. I turned around and saw a figure standing there in the distance, darker than the night sky around us. The instant I saw him, my stomach dropped and my body literally froze. I knew at that moment, somehow he was coming for me. I grabbed my dog's leash and we booked it. I mean, sprinting full speed up and down hills, around trees, down embankments. I was running so fast as if my life depended on it, and to this day I'm sure it was. I make the 30 to 45 minute trip in 10, and all that stands before me and my car is this switchback you must go back and forth on if you want to reach the top. So once again, I'm giving it all I got, running up this switchback as fast as I possibly can, and once I reach the top and look back down, who else but this person is chasing me? And does he go up the switchback like how any sane person would? Of course not. He starts sprinting right up the middle of this goddamn switchback, headed straight for me. I scream at him, "Fuck off!" And he doesn't say anything, not a single word, just continues running right at me. I am so lucky my car was at the top of that hill, because as I ran towards it, just like in the horror movies, I dropped my keys and fiddled with them, trying to open the door. Just in time, I get the door open, throw my dog in and shut the door behind me just as this guy reaches us. Best part is, there were no other vehicles parked anywhere around us, but where did this person park? Yeah, right next to me of all places. Now this guy literally jumps into his truck so fast, and to this day, I have never seen a better example of speeding out of there like a bat out of hell. He guns the engine so hard that black smoke is blasting out the back as he swerves out of there, leaving skid marks behind him. I sat in the back of my vehicle for hours afterwards, shaking and crying, knowing I was this close to whatever he had planned for me. And that's why I'm sharing this story, in hopes that people won't ignore that gut feeling, the little voice in the back of your head that tells you to run. If I did that day, I would never have noticed him in time, and would not have had the head start I needed to escape. Always trust your gut feelings and intuition. It might be the deciding factor in whether or not this is your final day on Earth. Okay, I should start this story by giving a bit of background so that you understand the situation a bit better. I, a 16-year-old, 4'9" female at the time, had 2 dogs who were brothers from the same litter. Now, being boxers, they were relatively big and quite protective when need be. Vince was much taller than his brother and was usually the kind to sleep through a hurricane if we had one. His brother Maury was shorter but more muscled and stronger. Usually these two were with me 24/7, as my mother used to work a lot and I was usually alone most of the day, sometimes even until after dark. This never really bothered me. I'd been left alone at home like this since I was 11. It never struck me that I had a reason to be worried. One day when my mum was working later, I was doing some household chores, feeding the dogs, doing dishes and stuff like that. I continued doing what I always had, a routine of tidying the house I'd done every day for years. As I went to take the trash out of the bin, I started walking towards the door when Maury stepped in front of me. I tried moving around him, telling him to get out of my way and sought, but he refused to budge. This was certainly odd, and looking back on it now, a few years later, I realised he was probably trying to stop me from walking outside. We continued like this for a few moments, me trying to get past him and him, of course, never moving from his spot. He was quite heavy as a big dog. It was difficult to lift him, and even harder to get him away from something. Now, in the time we had been going back and forth with this interaction, Vince stayed happily asleep on his dog bed. I should note that from my kitchen you can see the living room and bathroom. Usually we'd use the side door from the kitchen to enter and exit the house, since it attached to the carport. After a couple more minutes, I heard something I hadn't expected when I made one last desperate attempt to move Maury from his spot. He growled, which wasn't unusual as he had growled plenty in his life. What was unusual was that he growled at me. He had never done that before, not once. But for that reason and that reason alone, I decided not to take the trash out that night. I simply tossed it in another room and left it be. A short time passed, maybe a half hour or so. I had settled into my chair to watch a movie while I waited for my mum to come home. While I was watching the movie, I suddenly heard a quiet knock at the side door. As I mentioned earlier, you can clearly see the living room from the kitchen, so I heard the knock pretty well. It was already after dark, so I figured it was just my mother and she had somehow forgotten her keys. I got up, went into the kitchen, and out of the corner of my eye I saw the hook near the door. The keys weren't there. To some people that's not a big deal, but to me it meant that the person knocking on my door was in fact not my mother. My mum is a bit of a routine-obsessed person, so if she actually had forgotten her keys, they would always be on the hook. I took a breath, preparing myself to not answer the door, or, if they didn't leave, to tell them I wasn't interested in whatever was happening and that they should leave. Thinking about it now, I really wish I hadn't even looked out the window on the door. I wish I had just sat back down, called my mum and stayed out of sight. But of course I walked in front of the door and immediately came face to face with a figure on the other side of the window. Now it was really dark, with just my neighbour's light shining from his porch, so I could only make out a couple of things on this guy. He was tall, me having to peer up at him through the window to look at his face. He had long hair that looked like a shadow over his shoulders in the dim light, but the only facial feature I could really see were his eyes. God, I wish I hadn't seen them. I could see the spark of interest flare in them as he perked up when he saw me. They were wide and staring down at me. He took a step towards my door. Stepping up on the first of 2 steps, I heard him say something along the lines of, "My car broke down nearby. Could I come in and use your phone?" Immediately I thought of every bad thing I had ever heard happening to a teenager home alone and tried to compose my nerves. I'm not sure what it was, but something told me not to trust this man standing on the other side of my door. I shouted back a quick no, and an apology, hoping he was telling the truth and would go to the next house over. But he didn't. Instead, he simply repeated it, and quite a bit louder. I thought for a quick moment he hadn't heard me, but then again, I know now that he most likely had. So instead I became a bit more confident. "I'm sorry, I can't help you. Go to the next house." I shouted louder. For a moment he paused as if contemplating what to do. Then he knocked again, louder than the first time I'd heard it. My heart rate increased as I stared at him. When I didn't react, he started to loudly bang against the door. I stepped back, praying to whatever god that he would either leave or my mum would be home early. I was usually a quiet girl, but my mum was a badass redneck with a raptor knife. She could take him. He started to bang on the glass after a moment, my mind racing 1,000 miles an hour. Should I hide? Run? My phone was in the other room, and I was scared to take my eyes off the guy. I was sure he would break through the glass. The banging was vibrating my eardrums, and apparently it was vibrating Maury's too. I saw him creeping up past the doorway, bending his head, teeth bared. He started to bark loudly. The guy stopped momentarily, trying to see into the window at the floor where Maury stood. When he stopped barking, the guy mistakenly tried to jiggle the door handle. Now that's when Vince woke up. I swear to God, for a dog that was dead asleep 5 seconds prior, I'd never seen him move that fast. Ever. In only 2 seconds, Vince had his paws up on the door, growling like a hellhound at the devil's side at this man outside my home. The guy jumped, fell back and bolted it. I heard him say something as he started to run and saw another shadow. My mum came home shortly after I'd sprinted across my carport to my neighbour's. We called the police after I explained what had happened, and my neighbour had dragged his shotgun out before they even got there. He had insisted on looking for the guy. The police had said someone tried to pick the lock on my front door, but there was a lot of stuff in front of it, and it was really old, so it didn't open anymore. I went to bed that night uneasy, and so very thankful I had 2 dogs who were not only strong and big, but one that was vigilant and one that could practically kill if you let him. A few weeks went by and we hadn't heard from the cops, so eventually I stopped trying to think about it. Another month went by, and although I was a bit scared of being home alone, nothing else seemed to happen. Then we got another visit from the cops. What they told me made my heart sink in my chest, and still gives me chills to this day. They had caught the guys and realized they were stalking me. Yes, guys plural. 2 guys had apparently been stalking me without my knowledge for months. They had several photos of me, words they had written over them, awful words. The police had been fairly adamant that I changed my lock since they caught 2 guys, and there was evidence of a third. We moved shortly after that. I still pass by that house sometimes when I go to visit friends or do stuff around that area. A chill runs down my spine every time I do. To think that they never caught one of the guys was scary enough. The fact they tried to break into my house was worse, not to mention that I hadn't even known they were watching me. I still think about it even now. A few years later, I dread what would have happened if my dogs weren't there, and I dread even worse what they had planned to do if I'd opened the door or they had successfully broken in. I suppose they weren't expecting my dog since our backyard is fenced, and they mostly stayed indoors since it was so hot where I lived. I thank the universe every day that I had them, especially now. My mum never worked until after dark again after that, which in all honesty was fine with me. So, to the man they still haven't caught, let's not meet. Do you have scary stories you'd like to hear told? Send me an email at nocturnalreveries@proton.me. I will be sure to credit you. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more tales, both true and imagined. Until we meet again, I've been Basil, and you've been lovely. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Good night.